It's no secret that the Titan boss fights in Sonic Frontiers are a huge step up from previous Sonic bosses. Sonic bosses throughout the years have always been an interesting aspect of Sonic games, whether that's the 2D bosses in the classic Sonic games, or the stagnation of bosses in the more recent 3D Sonic games. The Titan boss fights in Sonic Frontiers completely go against the stagnation of previous games and create an experience that truly gives a feeling of awe and epicness. A little background of Sonic bosses is required before I can get into what makes the boss fights in Sonic Frontiers so special. What has now been dubbed as the Sonic Colors final boss formula is actually one that seemingly started with Sonic Unleashed, though in that game it was only used for the daytime bosses Egg Beetle, Egg Devil Ray, and Egg Lancer. The nighttime, and most importantly, final boss, had unique fights still. This Sonic Colors final boss formula is one that has now appeared in 3 of the more recent final bosses of 3D Sonic games, those being Sonic Forces, Sonic Lost World, and Sonic Colors of course. This final boss formula consists of Sonic, who is not Super Sonic, running automatically on rails towards the final boss. This formula has been heavily criticized for being too repetitive, and seeing as it has been used in at least 4 3D Sonic games, that criticism is pretty warranted. The main issues arise from the lack of control the player has during the fight. All you can do is move from side to side and jump. This restrictive control creates bosses that are all very similar, and in the case of Sonic Forces, almost an exact repeat of a previous boss. These bosses are almost all seen as either too easy or too boring. It was pretty obvious that Sonic Frontiers would need to make something new for its boss fights. Enter the Titans. Sonic Frontiers takes what would normally be a gimmick at the end of a 3D Sonic game and turns it into a fully fleshed out part of the game, that gimmick being Super Sonic. The use of Super Sonic gives way for an almost endless amount of possibilities in terms of gameplay, so it was clear almost from the start that the previous final boss formula would be gone, and not just for the final boss either. Every single Titan boss in this game has its own entirely unique set of mechanics and ways to go about defeating it. The Titan boss fights in Sonic Frontiers is one of the first times that a boss fight in a Sonic game is less of a transition between stages and now its own part of the game. Super Sonic during these boss fights has all the combat special moves that you would have normally, which creates a ton of combo opportunities, even if some of those attacks are clearly better than others. These definitely aren't the pinnacle of boss fights across all gaming or anything, and there is still a lot more that could be done, but in terms of Sonic boss fights, they are a huge leap forward from anything else that has come before it, especially in recent years. The first Titan boss you encounter in Sonic Frontiers is Giganto. Yeah, kinda a lame name, but it definitely fits its description. Giganto is probably the best Titan that could have been used as an introduction to this style of boss fight, as there aren't a ton of mechanics that will catch you off guard as you learn this new style of boss fight. The way the boss fights in Sonic Frontiers work is that Super Sonic encounters a giant Titan, and in 3 of the 4 fights, has free movement in an arena, and the goal is to deal as much damage as possible before you run out of rings. In the case of Giganto, Super Sonic is given every attack he normally has, just extra powerful. Giganto has a few different attacks. Some are basic sweeping attacks that are easily parryable, while the other attacks consist of quick time events to avoid death. This boss fight works so well because unlike the Sonic Colors formula, you have full control over Super Sonic's movement and attacks, making the fight feel a lot more engaging and downright fun to play. Each Titan in Frontiers has 2 phases, where they transform and gain some new attacks in their second phase. In Giganto's case, it gains a ton of lasers on its back, and a new laser beam attack. Giganto serves as a perfect introduction of what to expect from the boss fights in Sonic Frontiers, and is a massive improvement over previous Sonic bosses, and this is only the first boss fight. I'd like to move on to the next boss, but I don't think I can yet without mentioning the music for these boss fights. The Sonic series always has incredible music, even those that aren't Sonic fans know that, and these boss fights do not disappoint. I was lucky enough to go in blind for these fights on day 1, and hearing the soundtrack for the first time, it just wasn't something I was expecting. The song for this fight in particular is undefeatable, and I know it's a lot of people's favorites out of the bunch. Moving on to the only boss that doesn't feature an arena to fly around in is the second Titan boss, Wyvern. Much better name right off the bat. Wyvern may seem familiar at first, because the flight is more on rails following a set path, but you hardly almost notice it with how much is going on during the fight. Wyvern has a variety of attacks, but really Super Sonic's attacks are what shine here in this fight. The parry counter sees Super Sonic grabbing onto Wyvern and swinging it around before slamming it into the cliffside. The second phase also features some really cool scripted sequences, and just in general, the spectacle of this fight is probably the best one in the game. You may be on rails for this fight, but you aren't just moving in a straight line. Supersonic and Wyvern continually make laps around Ares Island as they both battle each other. The music for this boss is also my personal favorite out of them all, being... This Titan boss provides something different from Giganto, while also keeping the same new formula of a supersonic boss. And in general, this one is just as good as the Giganto fight. The third Titan boss fight in Frontiers is Knight, and it definitely looks like a knight, and attacks like one too. Knight has probably the most in-depth mechanics of these Titans, featuring a shield and sword that you must play around and both avoid and utilize. At the beginning of the fight, Knight will put up its shield and block incoming damage, but then will throw the shield at Supersonic, and as Supersonic, you use the shield against Knight and fly directly into it, dealing damage. This section is a bit janky, but riding on top of a shield with spinning blades more than makes up for that. Taking Knight down to the second phase of the fight introduces a new mechanic, parrying the shield. Knight will throw its shield into the arena, and you must get in front of the shield's path so that you can parry it and throw it right back to stun the Titan. This boss definitely gets points for having cool and interesting mechanics during the fight. Something I haven't mentioned up until now is that Supersonic is also still able to use Psyloop during these fights, and using Psyloop on Knight twice summons a giant spear that pierces right through it and slams it into the ground, and it's just one of the coolest things during the fight. The music for Knight is Find Your Flame, which I also really like, and I know is a favorite of many others. Knight takes the previously seen formula used by Wyvern and primarily Giganto, and still creates a new and inventive fight that has great moments. The final Titan fight in Sonic Frontiers is Supreme. This fight is pretty similar to Giganto, and there are some genuine mechanics given for this fight, but in practice, you can almost skip them entirely. Supreme features a similar look to Giganto, with a bunch of diamonds that shoot out cube projectiles at Supersonic to try and knock him back. The main goal here is to destroy all of the diamond turrets, but you can still access the boss without doing so, and you are only punished with being knocked back every so often. The reason this punishment is often worth it is because of the very low health the boss has. By this point in the game, Sonic has been leveling up his stats, and Sonic's damage output doesn't accurately reflect in the boss's health. This boss feels like a fun challenge with level 1 stats, or with mods making it more difficult, but anything above 50 strength makes this fight pretty easy. Even though the boss may be a bit easy, it still does provide you with a place to go crazy with attacks without really having to think about what you're doing. In the second phase, Supreme gains Wings of Light and starts to fly around the arena, making it so that you have to chase it around to deal damage. Because this is the final Titan boss, the main theme for Sonic Frontiers, I'm Here, is used during this fight, and it is just as good as the rest of the Titan themes. Overall, this boss fight leaves a bit to be desired, but improvements are supposed to be coming in one of the later updates for the game. Sonic Frontiers finally breaks the mold of old Sonic boss fights, and gives something brand new to mess around with. With Sonic Frontiers, the Sonic Colors final boss formula has hopefully now been retired in favor of this new style of bosses. And while they don't always have to be Titans, seeing Supersonic battling a giant kaiju is an unforgettable experience. It's even gotten to the point now where anytime a giant monster, or even something that looks like one, starts trending, everyone immediately rushes to draw Supersonic battling it, which I personally think is awesome.
More Supersonic art, please.
While some aspects of these fights could be improved, they're a huge step forward in terms of Sonic boss fights, and they are featured throughout the entire game, not just the final boss. The music and spectacle of these fights makes playing and replaying these fights a super enjoyable experience, and I hope Sonic Team is able to continue iterating and making new and fun boss fights in Sonic games, because Frontiers has set a new standard for Sonic boss fights. Thanks for sticking around until the end of the video. If you enjoyed, consider doing the usual and leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and maybe I'll see you next time.